Well, welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest living here in Austin, Texas. Celebrated 53 years of recovery this week, and I'm still alive to talk about it. So it's good to be here and back with you guys. We are starting a new series, and I'm really excited about this. We've talked a lot about the Oxford Group and a little tiny bit about Frank Bookman, the founder of it, and tried to see how that was connected to Alcoholics Anonymous, because I think it's really foundational to our 12 steps and how that has all come about. And we are honored to have as our guest Dave Belden out in California. Dave was born into a family of Oxford Group members. They were committed people, activists, and the group set out to change the world. Of course, Bill Wilson was only interested in changing drunks. He said, the hell with the world. But David took the original message, and he was out to change the world. And then when he went to Africa, he got changed in another direction. And for what were the social implications? He left the Oxford Group. In one sense, he left it. And then he went back to Oxford and wanted to do his dissertation, his PhD, on the history of the Oxford Group. And he wrote that. I read it several years ago. It was well done, excellent piece of history, and I put that in the show notes. But then more recently, he wrote another book. It's called The World Remakers Child, subtitled A Memoir of Activism and Healing. I think this is my take, he had to go back and get rid of the anger and some of the stuff that had been put upon him and see what was the thing that first attracted him. What was it about that? It's a beautifully written book. I can't recommend it to you highly enough. Get a copy. Link is in the show notes. And what we're going to do in this first episode is go through, I want to introduce you to David and have him introduce himself to you. And then we're going to get into the life of Frank Bookman and see what was he about and what was he attempting to do. What did he do right and what did he do wrong? And what can we learn from all of that? So Dave, welcome to the podcast. It's really, really great to have you with us here.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Bill. I'm really excited and partly because there's a lot that I would like to learn from you. So I hope this is a real exchange. I'm sure it will be.
Yeah, let's feel free to go back and forth. I'm intimidated when I have an Oxford University graduate, so bear with me. All my insecurities come out, but I can tell from your book you're a very kind man and you'll go easy with me.
So Bill, after I completed my doctorate at Oxford, I spent the next 20 years earning my living as a carpenter.
Yes.
I mean, of course, that sounds very biblical when I say it like that, but actually, so I didn't want a life in academia, and I had to suppress the fact that I had a doctorate from Oxford. Absolutely. That would not have helped on the building side.
In future episodes, we're going to go deeper into the Oxford Group, link to the to AA, how all of that really came about. And we'll have some really good discussion. But this first episode, Dave, let's give us 5 minutes on what you grew up with, how it changed, and why you went away and why you came back, sort of.
Just in 5 minutes. I just...
You can do it. Highlights.
Okay. So I was raised in the London headquarters of the Oxford Group. The group had like 7 big communal houses because it was the cheapest way really to house all their activists. But these were big posh houses in the West End, stone's throw from Embassy Land, the American Embassy and so on. And they were really like the movement's embassies to the world. So I was raised in this very... we were on display. My parents were leaders in the movement. They had been recruited in the early 1930s to the Oxford Group in Oxford and London. So in the 1930s, the Oxford Group was very much a spiritual religious revival. And they didn't have property. They just met in hotels and people's homes and Oxford colleges and so on. But after the war, they acquired conference centres and these houses in London and a theatre, because they began to spread their message through plays. And my father was in charge of this theatre, and we had loads of people come to the theatre, but also often come to our house and these other 7 houses for dinner first. So my mother served 23,000 meals one year in our home. It was a big communal house, etc. So I'm just saying that to say I was in Oxford Group Central. Of course, by then, although it was the official name of the charity in England was the Oxford Group, by then it had changed its name to Moral Rearmament. Very confusing for people, and now it's called something else again. So just briefly, what can I say briefly?
Well, I would say that you took the message hook, line, and sinker.
What they call a true believer.
I've been accused of that by some people in the 12-step world, too. I don't know that it's a compliment.
I was so very sincerely committed. And when I was 17, I accepted an invitation to go and work with MRA, it was called. The Oxford Group was Moral Rearmament, MRA, in India, where it was led by Mahatma Gandhi, who was a grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. So I went to India for 6 months right after finishing high school. And that is what hugely changed my life. And then later, after my undergraduate years, I went to Ethiopia for a year with the movement, and that sort of completed that life change. And what that amounted to was the Oxford Group had been really, really good at conflict resolution. Mm-hmm. But what about poverty? What about world development? What about the inequalities of world trade? Were we actually doing anything to help the poor of the world? I didn't think we were, or not enough. In fact, that was what took me out of the movement. I became enamored of the left, socialism, of structural changes. And if you like, the whole rest of my life, I've been searching for ways to really combine the two. How do we combine structural changes with the personal transformational change that you saw in the Oxford Group and that you see in AA?
It's like one has one hand, the other has the other hand, but the two never really meet.
They often, they do sometimes meet.
Sometimes for a moment.
We can talk about that probably
Camelot.
at a future episode, but mostly no. They feel like two silos, and they're separate.
Yeah. That's what I loved about your book. I can feel the search going on in you. And I think it's the search for anyone who's really serious about life-changing. And, in my own case, I got stuck for 20 years in the AA world, which has no opinion on outside issues, no opinion on religious affiliations and such. It takes a very super neutral view of those. And so that part never got developed. And I had it when I went into it. In spades, I had it. But then when I went into the 12-step world, it was like, no, we leave that at the door. And I never picked it up until I started reading in some depth about the group and what they were committed to and what this crazy guy, Frank Bookman, was all about. So let's move into his life.
Yeah.
If we can. And then we'll go back in future episodes and go deeper into some of the stuff that you have touched on. But tell us about, I think you referred to him at one place in your book as Uncle Frank, if I remember.
Yes. So the picture on the front cover of my book is of me as a small boy looking very puzzled and perhaps overawed. Yeah. And what's happening, my sister is standing next to me and she has a sign saying, "Welcome, Uncle Frank." So what I'm puzzled about is that Uncle Frank is coming to wherever we were. I think this was in Switzerland, and I was overawed by him. He was like our saint. He was really trying to understand him has been a major part of my life. He actually christened me, so I always felt a little bit special, along with several other of my friends who he christened. Anyway, who was this man? He was an American. He was a Pennsylvania German family. They hadn't actually come from Germany, but from a German canton of Switzerland. He was born in this small town, Penzberg, where really German, or a kind of particular German dialect, Swiss German sounding dialect, was the most frequently spoken language around him. he learned his English, I presume, in school. They were Lutheran, and he went to school, private school, run by a group called the Schwenkfelders. The Schwenkfelders were what's sometimes called the left wing of the Reformation. They were like Anabaptists way back in the 1500s. They were very radical people who didn't really think very much of the state, government. What they wanted was, they were basically theocrats, but they wanted a direct line to God. They believed in the inner light, in the fact that God can speak to each person, which, if you think about it, is the most radically democratic thing. If everybody has their own hotline to God, then how are you going to tell anybody what to do? So anyway.
No, the churches don't like that very much.
No, not very much.
That's our job, they say.
Right. So the Schwenkfelders are like the Quakers. I mean, in fact, I think the Schwenkfelders had some impact on the Quakers. I don't know all this history too well. But it's interesting to me that Bookman, his first school, was run by the Schwenkfelders. His father ran a general store and then a railway hotel full of passengers coming through. The railways had recently come. I mean, this is small-town America in the 1880s. 1890s. Very exciting time to be an American, I think, because the whole world was opening up. Basically, American conquest, if you like to call it that, of the whole of North America, or of the United States in part of North America, the indigenous peoples and so on. That was complete, and the United States was now looking abroad.
Yeah, and all the
Philippines and the Spanish American War and all that stuff, and huge missionary efforts around the world were suddenly now being made by Americans. And that's what Frank Bookman early got involved with. So he went to seminary, Lutheran seminary. He was asked to start a church in a suburb of Philadelphia. He had to raise the money for the church building, for everything. He was quite successful at it. He was a man of enormous energy. So I think he was pretty successful at whatever he did. His father sent him on a trip to Europe. He was always very interested in Germany and in Switzerland. He got very taken with a sort of what was called a hospice system in Switzerland for travelers. He came back, and this was also the time when the settlement houses were being founded in this country, helping young people, white people, black people. There was Hull House in Chicago.
Kind of the beginning of social work.
Yes, that's exactly right. The Phyllis Wheatley homes for black people, they were sort of coming from the countryside into the big, scary city, and these young people needed a home. So Bookman opened a home for young Lutheran men, and then after a while he got into a big conflict with the board that ran it, and he resigned.
Spending too much money feeding these guys.
That's right. I mean, Bookman definitely inherited that. I mean, his parents were running a hotel and German hospitality. Sex was definitely a problem in that tradition, but food was sort of the answer. So Bookman was spending too much money. They made his life impossible. He sort of resigned in a real major mental or nervous breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
And he went to Europe, and he was traveling around, and he went to something called the Keswick Convention, which was in the north of England. Now, this is another of these strands of Christianity that is very interesting, like the Schwenkfelders, like the Quakers. This wasn't particularly about the inner voice. This was more about the inner experience. The woman who had a huge impact on Bookman at that time, Jessie Penn Lewis, was a woman who believed that contemplation of the crucifixion would actually enable you to deal with sin in your life, to a large extent get rid of sin in your life. She talked about victory over sin. The Keswick movement talked about entire sanctification. When you got converted from their point of view, this was when you changed your beliefs. And that might get you into heaven, but the next phase of your life, you actually had to learn this sanctification, this victory over sin. So the reason I'm going into this is...
No, I'm glad you are.
First of all, Bookman was sitting in this little church where Jessie Penn Lewis gave this sermon about the crucifixion and liberation from sin. And suddenly he had some huge epiphany, some huge personal experience of liberation from his hatred of these. He was truly angry and hating against the board of the hospice. He was liberated from it. And whatever it was, there's another whole side to Bookman's story, which is that there's no doubt really that he was homosexual by nature. And this was a huge thing for him to struggle with. And my guess, although I don't know, is that that was part of his thing, because I think that somehow he got liberation from his own sexual needs or something. I don't know what it was. It was very profound. And of course, in a very homophobic era. Today, it would be a completely different path that a young Christian homosexual can tread. But for him, he had to learn how to be completely celibate. And I think that exactly what happened to him, I don't know, but it was a hugely empowering experience. So when you look at Alcoholics Anonymous, the thing that really strikes me about Bookman's contribution is that there'd been this huge temperance movement that I'm sure you know more about than I do, but it had engaged massive numbers of people in North America and Europe. An awful lot of women in particular were very exercised about it, because so many men were getting drunk and spending their meager wages on drink, not looking after their families. The demon drink was an absolute horror from their point of view. From the church's point of view, all these sermons was preached against it, and then finally prohibition was passed in this country. None of this actually seemed to make a great deal of difference to the alcohol problem.
Right.
It wasn't a cure. It was a cry of pain about it and an attempt to control it, which really, is not so powerful a thing to do with any addiction. Self-control may help work for some.
They push it down.
They push it down, yes.
And then it pops up again.
Exactly. So then out of the blue comes this Bookman character. He became very adept at what he called life-changing. He reckoned that most people's problems were not with belief, but with sin.
That's a dirty word in 12.
I know it is.
You'll never hear that word.
No, I don't use it myself.
I don't either.
Myself either. No. So we have to try and do some translation here. You could say that the problem was more with behavior than belief. That's one way to look at it.
I look at it as separation. Separation from others, separation from the divine, separation from your true self. And that's the way I look at Bookman's situation. He was separated from those 6 guys on the board. Yeah. And then he got joined with them. I'm the 7th wrong man.
Right.
He was separated from God, perhaps through his sexual proclivities there, and he got that healed. True self is the final journey that we're all engaged on. That's a battle with the ego.
Right.
Yeah. So the psychological element is extremely important. So anyway, I'm sorry I jumped in.
No, that's really you're going very deep very quickly here, Bill, and I think you're right to do so. And exactly, we can talk more about this, and I'm not the world's greatest expert, but what is Christianity really about? Is it truly about beliefs, things, cognitive things?
Right.
Or is it truly about experiences, I was blind and now I see. St. Paul falling off his horse, it wasn't because he suddenly had a cognitive thought. It was because
he had an experience of the divine. Wow.
An experience of the divine, yes, and of divine power. I think that is what Bookman experienced, was actually a power in his life that enabled him to stop hating those men or resentment, dealing with the power to actually change your experience. So, for example, there was this big revivalist, Billy Sunday, who was in the long tradition of American revivalism. He was leading huge revivals in New York City during the First World War, or just after it, I think. It was just after it. And Bookman, what they did at these huge rallies was that they invited anybody who wanted to give their life to Jesus to come down to the front and have a personal conversation with a minister. And in some huge hall in New York City, they had all these inquiry rooms down underneath the hall where individual ministers would meet with people. And Bookman was organizing these personal workers. And while Billy Sunday was telling people to stop drinking, to give up drink, Bookman was down there training people how to actually help people to find the power to stop drinking. For him, it was when he talked about sin, he was also talking about what I think today we would often talk about in terms of trauma.
Right.
Like, what are the things that have hurt you so badly in your life that you're trying to numb out from them? Anyway, he was really quite a master at helping people.
It reminds me of, I added a chapter in my book. I didn't want to go there, but I had to go there on the inner child. You can listen to God, and isn't that lovely? But if you're not listening to your inner child, to the kid who was hurt, you're missing the boat.
Yeah, so I love that in your book. And I've spent many, I'm jumping ahead here, but I've spent many.
We're going all over the place, Dave.
I've spent many hundreds of hours in what you might call trauma recovery.
Good.
With people in prison, lifers in prison. For them, the journey that they need to go through so often is what was the hurt that was done to them before they hurt somebody else.
Right, exactly.
There's often a really strong connection.
Mm-hmm.
You see this particularly in sexual abuse, that someone who's in prison for sexually abusing a child was so often sexually abused himself as a child. Anyway, we won't. Just to say, Bookman, I think, intuited a lot of this. He didn't have the modern language for it. I'm excited about how to update his ideas, but I still think that he was incredibly good at, he was very interested in helping alcoholics, but he had a much, much bigger goal in mind. So maybe we could switch to that.
Yeah, let's go on to that. He was out to change the world.
So I think we have to see him as a child of the 1880s, 90s, like I was saying. This was the time when the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, was a Christian evangelical group, and they got very involved with the mission field and with recruiting young university graduates from Ivy Leagues to go and be missionaries in China and India and around the world. And this was a really remarkable thing that happened at that time, because missionaries had typically been lower middle class people. You sign up as a missionary and then you're suddenly some important person and you have servants and what have you. But you wouldn't, nobody from the Ivy League would sign up. But during the 1880s and 90s, there was this real religious revivals, evangelical revival, in which hundreds of college graduates signed up for the foreign missions. And their leader, in many ways, was a man called John R. Mott, wrote a book, which the subtitle, I'm trying to get it in my head, something like, the title of the book was The Evangelization of the World in This Generation. And the subtitle was Universities as Strategic Points in the World's Conquest. Conquest? Whoa.
Conquest, yes.
That's an interesting word for an evangelical supporter of missions. But this man, John R. Mott, recognized in the young Bookman a kindred spirit, and he recruited him to be the YMCA leader, secretary, I think they called him, at Penn State College. And Penn State was notoriously a football college and massive drunken parties, and that was his reputation. And Bookman went there. He spent, 6 years or something there, and he had a phenomenal success evangelizing Penn State College until, he had a majority of the students turning up to Bible studies. And then he got recruited again by John R. Mott. And
he converted the bootlegger.
There's a whole story
Bill
about
Pickle. I love that name, Bill Pickle.
No, there's a wonderful story and they made a play of it that when I was a child, I loved this play called Pickle Hill about Bill Pickle, the bootlegger, who had 10 children, and all my friends were playing the children, and I always wanted to be one of the children, but I never got picked to be anyway. Bookman, yes, got the bootlegger off drink and back into looking after his family, and it had a huge impact. And the agnostic dean was another person who he managed to give an experience of Jesus to, and the most popular student, a character called Blair Buck. So this was always taught to us.
And it was strategic, too.
Yes, that's how it was taught to us was if you want to change something, you have to be strategic. You have to go for the leading, most influential characters. It always struck me when, as I was growing up, it was that, oh, he changed these particular individuals. But as I learned more about it, I discovered that he was actually massively organizing everybody on campus to do Bible studies and so on as well. I mean, he was quite the organizer. So but then he got recruited to go to the foreign missions where he was leading revival campaigns among the missionaries and among the people they were working with in India and China. This is when you discover that this strategic thinking that Bookman had developed at Penn State, there's a document where he talks about the leading Chinese Christians in each city in China and how to rally them to turn the whole country towards God. So very, very ambitious. The whole history of Christians in China is really interesting because mostly it was low-income people, if anyone, who got converted to Christianity. And then there was this moment when China was utterly humiliated after the Opium Wars and China had been the most important country in the world, certainly from the Chinese perspective, forever. It had been the center of the world. And suddenly the barbarian foreigners had come and defeated them. And it was a huge moment of rethinking. A lot of missionaries were signing up young educated people in the cities with science classes, at the end of which they would enroll them in Bible classes. It was like using the prestige, the scientific prestige of the West to get people into Bible classes. And in fact, if I remember this right, Mao Zedong, as a 16, 17-year-old, was interested in Christian missions, but in the end, he took another Western philosophy instead, because communism, had come from the West also. So these different ideologies of the West were competing for China. And Bookman was very much the kind of man who saw the huge big picture.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time during the Oxford Group when in its greatest success in the 90s, when people wanted it to be just about individual personal transformation. And some of them, when Bookman, the famous, actually it's not famous, but in my head it's famous, statement that Bookman said to Bill Wilson, when Bill Wilson took the alcohol squad of the Oxford Group off and made it into Alcoholics Anonymous, Bookman said to him something like, you may be called to save drunks, but we are called to save drunken nations. And this was 1937, 38, and 1938, when the whole world was all about military rearmament.
Mm-hmm.
Bookman renamed the Oxford Group Moral Rearmament. He thought moral and spiritual rearmament was what was needed. So I hated that name, Moral Rearmament, when I was growing up in it, because who wants to be moral and who wants to be rearmed? It felt sort of both. Anyway, I won't go into that. But
well, it's kind of like the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament. It's, it's Jesus out there helping the poor and loving everybody and your neighbor. And then if you don't, he's coming after you on a war horse. Quite a switch.
All these, yes. That would be unfair to Bookman because he really, but I get what you're saying because, yes, armament. Anyway, it's sort of onward Christian soldiers. But
that's right.
But really, and some people complained. So the very best book about the Oxford Group, I think, is this one called For Sinners Only by A.J. Russell, which is you can get now through 12-step sources. I think I saw recently that it was actually reprinted and that I think some 12-steppers have reprinted this book. And it's a lovely book. It was what took my father into the Oxford Group. He hated the whole idea of the Oxford Group, my father, when he was 20 years old and undergraduate. But then he read this book and it sounded so enticing and exciting, a sort of troubadours of the spirit, they called them, these early Oxford groupers. A.J. Russell, who wrote that book, was a journalist. He later, during the moral rearmament phase, he left the Oxford Group and he thought that Bookman had acquired political ambitions or something.
Mm-hmm.
He thought it was against the spirit of the Oxford Group. But the reason that I'm mentioning Bookman in China, which was in 1916, 17, 18, around that time, and his plans for converting the leaders of China. This was Bookman's philosophy all along, and it came from this John R. Mott attitude of the conquest of the world in our generation. Bookman changed that word conquest, thank goodness, because this is a very important point about Bookman. Because his focus was on the heart, on the experience of God, of Jesus in your life, and not the belief. He believed that this experience was open to anybody. Atheist, Muslim, Jew, Taoist, anybody could have some sort of universal experience, which I think you a few minutes ago were starting to express deeply about the false self and the deeper self and so on.
The original first step said having had a spiritual experience. It later got changed to a spiritual awakening. But this is what Bill Wilson was introduced to, that you have to have this experience.
Right.
And so he wrote that into his first step, or 12th actually. And then they changed that to a more tepid form, he called it, an awakening. And he wanted to change it back, and they wouldn't let him. I thought that was interesting. He said he liked experience. Liked the word experience.
Right.
But they wouldn't let him change it. The machine had taken over by then.
When I wrote my doctoral thesis about the Oxford Group, and I read all these antecedents, because from my perspective, growing up in the Oxford Group, it just all seemed to have come out of the mind of Frank Bookman. And I just didn't think that could possibly be true. I'd studied history, and what I wanted to know was where actually did all these ideas come from. And I discovered this whole tradition within Christianity that I've mentioned, Schwenkfelders, Quakers, the Keswick Convention. Another term for this is pietism.
Right.
The pietists, as their name implies, were actually about the quality of life that you lead. It's what kind of life are you leading more than
what are you believing?
What do you believe? And of course, my favorite parable in the New Testament about this is the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan did the right thing. Anybody I didn't know this growing up, but Samaritans were a Jewish sect who believed the wrong thing from the point of view of mainstream Jewish people of the time. They had a different, and it doesn't really matter, but they were like apostate Jews from the point of view of mainstream Jews. So Bookman chose this person who believed the wrong thing, but who did the right thing and said, love is what it's about. Caring for each other is what it's about. So it seems to me that this has always been a dualistic thing in Christianity. Are you going to focus more on the love, the teachings of Jesus? Jesus taught, the actual teachings of Jesus are all about love and, I'm not going to... Compassion, humility,
justice.
But then welcoming the stranger, all of these things, all of which came from Judaism. But the creeds that, I was raised Episcopal. I learned those creeds early on. Mm-hmm. They're not about the teachings of Jesus.
No.
They're beliefs about Jesus. Who is he? He is the Son of God. And, there are three parts to God and all of that. Those are beliefs.
Somebody described the creeds as leaving out the middle. He's born, it's a virgin and all this good stuff, and then he dies and the value. But it leaves out the middle.
It leaves out the teachings.
The teachings. The Sermon on the Mount. The 1 Corinthians 13, the letter of James. And those were the things that the Oxford Group people promoted.
Right. So within the evangelical world, there's a sort of split. Some people believe that you have to believe in Jesus as your Savior if you're going to get to heaven. Other people would say what it's really about is love and compassion and caring for your neighbor and loving God, loving yourself, loving your neighbor. That's the key.
Foundation. That's foundational.
Right. But down through the history of Christianity, you can see that some groups, went more to the belief side, and some went more to the other side. And I thought that the term that really appealed to me was experiential, the experiential tradition in Christianity. So what happened with Bookman is that he inherited this experiential tradition of Christianity, but within a really unusual context where America was opening out into the world and had extraordinary. And one of the most beautiful things about America, I could say as a Brit who's come to live in America, is a sort of naive optimism about the world and about America itself, about the goodness of America. Anyway, I'm not going to get into
We will
all of
get
that
into
right
some
now,
of
but,
that. We will get into some of that.
But I think that Bookman really tried to combine this experiential Christian tradition of changing your life with the idea that the whole world could be better. And one of the quotes from his that I really always loved, that sometimes when you look this quote up online, it's sometimes attributed to Mahatma Gandhi.
Mm-hmm.
But the quote is, "There is enough in the world for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. If everybody cared enough and everybody shared enough, everybody would have enough." That's an essential vision of how caring could actually change the whole economic system of the world. That was the sort of global idealism that Bookman acquired from being raised an American in the 1880s and 90s and early part of the century.
Well, let's give the measure of the man and then the shortcomings of the man to take his inventory, if they'll forgive us for that. His greatest strengths and his weaknesses. While you think about that, I'm going to read a little portion from your book on Bookman's methods, okay? I think these are yours, eh? Don't argue about theology or politics, or in fact, don't argue about anything.
Let me just say, he didn't write these things down. This is my understanding of
your summary of his. Yeah. But I think they're great. Going. Yeah. And they have real applicability to the 12-step philosophy. And we'll go deeper into that. Don't call yourself an evangelist. Soul surgeon or life changer sounds more modern. Don't talk about being saved. Still less about hell. Talk about life. Don't blame or shame people for their sins. Instead, show how God can liberate them. Don't be shy talking about sexual sins with young men in private. Freud knew sex was obsessing them. If you don't get to a good sex inventory in your 4th step, you've missed it. You've really missed it, hey? Don't start a new church or a new sect. Encourage people to stay in their existing ones, but bring it to life. It goes on. It's marvelous stuff. Get a hold of this book, guys. It's a life changer, shall we say. It's a life changer. You get to the nitty gritty of what Bookman was trying to get to, and you put it in modern language, and you do it with great vulnerability. That's the thing I wanted to really compliment you on. I know this book did not come about easily for you. Wrote a couple of different versions of it and tried to maybe pass over some stuff. And then you said, oh, the hell with it. I'm just going to get honest as I can be. And you did. And it shows. And that's what changes people. I think Bookman would have been proud of what you did.
No.
He probably would have said, don't publish the damn thing, but it's good. It's good material.
That's such an interesting thought. Yeah, no, I would love to think that Bookman would be happy with this book. Yeah, goodness.
So what were his shortcomings? The movement grew. It grew in the 30s. That was its heyday. 100,000 people in England coming to some of his
house parties. That's what.
Well, this was a hell of a house party.
It was, yes, 100,000 people in some huge place in Birmingham, but I think they still called it a house party.
They still called it a house party, right? Yeah.
Also, he filled the Hollywood Bowl in, I forget what year, and, thousands were turned away and so on. So, he had his moment in this country as well.
How did he lose it? How did he lose sight of it? He was something in his earlier years that he was less so in his later years. Was that fair? Did he go for the numbers rather than for the man? That's the way I would see it. If you strive for success without changing the individual, you come up with a list of things and isn't this nice, but people remain unchanged.
No, I don't.
You don't agree with that?
That's not the way that I would primarily see it.
Okay, good.
I think that what happened is that he became much, much more involved in international affairs, and he saw what he was doing as so critical to the future of the world, if you think about the late 1930s and then all through the war period, everybody who had any kind of stake in the country, the sort of middle and upper classes especially, but many working people as well, conflict was the thing that they most feared. A lot of working people wanted more conflict in terms of class struggle.
Go on strike and things of that nature, huh?
Yes, like at the end of the war in Britain, Winston Churchill, who had been the extraordinary war leader and had kept Britain going, was in many ways the hero of the time. He stood for election for Parliament as the Prime Minister, and he got defeated. The Labour Party was elected because people actually wanted things like the National Health Service. They thought, we've bust our gut for this country, and now we need to get our reward. I was raised with the National Health Service, which I'm incredibly grateful for. It was a brilliant thing. But what I was going to say was how to deal with conflict was what concerned Bookman. And after the war, they started up this conference center in Switzerland where they invited thousands of Germans, French, everybody from Europe, British and Americans to come to try and build the new Europe. This was hugely ambitious because, for example, at that same time, 1947, when they had their first conference, the International Labour Organization was meeting in Switzerland, and they refused to have any Germans present. Even though the Germans who wanted to come from Germany were socialists, they had not been Nazis. There was a saying that no hotel in Europe would accept a party of Germans in that era, 1946, 47, 48. The anger and hatred towards the Germans was extreme. Bookman and a character that I talk about quite a lot in my book, my own godfather, Philippe Martou, who was a Swiss diplomat, they created this conference center, and they managed to get the first large parties of Germans to leave Germany when Germany was still split up into the American sector, the British sector, the Russian sector, the French sector. They had to get permissions from these different governments to allow people to come to the conference center at Co, C-A-U-X, Co in Switzerland. And that's why I was born in Switzerland. My parents were helping to create this conference center. And I tell the story in my book, which I think should be well known throughout the world, but is really barely known at all, about this. It's the story of a French woman. So Irene Law was the leader of the resistance in Marseille in the south of France. She had been elected to the assembly in Paris. She had been chosen as the leader of the socialist women of France. She was a Marxist. She was one of the people that the Oxford Group invited to come to their conference center. They sent two men to her office and invited her to come. I mean, they were quite ambitious. This is strategic thinking. How do you get the Bill Pickle, the agnostic dean? Who are the key players in Europe? Invite them to come. I mean, Konrad Adenauer was one of the people who was invited. He became the German chancellor, the leader of Germany for many, many years. So anyway, this woman, Irene Law, she was invited. And the reason she came was that her children had been severely malnourished during the war when she was fighting for the resistance. She wanted them to have some fresh air in the Swiss Alps. So she comes. She has a lovely conference center, lovely fresh air. The children are happy. They're being fed well. And then she hears that a party of Germans is going to come. Oh, my God. She packs her bags and she's walking out of the conference center in absolute anger. Her son, by the way, her oldest son, had been tortured by the Germans. So she's walking out when Frank Bookman encounters her in the lobby. This is a classic Bookman story. It's almost like God had told him to be in the lobby at that moment. No one's ever said that to me, but how was it that Frank Bookman was there at the moment when this woman leaves the conference center? And he says to her, Madame Law, how are you going to create the new Europe without the Germans? She is a very idealistic woman. She knows he's right, but she doesn't know what to do about it. And she actually turns around, goes back to her room and refuses food or company for something like 3 days. I mean, she doesn't eat. She doesn't sleep. I don't know what happened with her children. Finally, one of the MRA women says to her, would you like to meet a German? And she says, all right. And they go down stairs to have lunch with a German woman who, it turns out, was actually the widow of one of the men who had tried to assassinate Hitler and had been executed for it, because my godfather, Philipp Martyr, had been very involved with that plot against Hitler. But anyway, she was one of the many Germans who was present. And so these two women sit down together, and the German woman apologizes to Irene Law. And Irene Law, I tell this story better in the book because, I'm not getting the exact details. But there's a moment when Irene Law reaches out her hand and puts her hand on the German woman's hand. I can almost feel myself cry as I talk about it, because
Yes.
This is a moment when she wanted to give up her hatred.
It's like Bookman in that church
Exactly.
hating those 6 guys on the board.
Exactly.
And that's why the big book talks about resentment is the greatest offender.
Yes.
All goes back to this. Go ahead.
And it's about, where do we get the power to deal with things that are running our lives?
Lack of power is our dilemma.
Yes.
That's it. We stood at the turning point, asked his protection and care with complete abandon.
Right. And this is why the 12 steps begins with admitting that we're powerless.
Right. That's right.
And one of Bookman's sayings was, a small sense of need means a small sense of God. A large sense of need leads to a large sense of God. It's like, I'm an agnostic. That's a story in itself.
Well, I think at depth we all are.
Okay, well,
that's my take on it. That if you haven't recognized your agnostic side, you haven't done a good inventory.
Okay, good man. Yes, thank you for an Episcopal priest. This was interesting. But I think that the point that we're not going to get anywhere as human beings if we don't really recognize that there are things that have such power in our lives. We don't really have the capacity to deal with them by willpower alone. There has to be other ways. So this Irene Law is meeting with this woman. She's not a believer. She's a Marxist, an atheist, but they end up praying together.
Mm.
And she prays that this hatred will be taken away from her. And it is. She has that experience of the hatred. So she gets up on a platform in this conference center because they've brought all these people together. They brought ex-Nazis. They've brought ex-resistance fighters. They've brought, etc., all kinds of people. Great old mix of Europe. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of people in this conference. But they're not giving them political speeches. They're not even giving them incredibly idealistic speeches. What they're doing is these are like huge 12-step recovery meetings.
Exactly.
They're getting up and talking about their personal issues and how they recovered from them. She actually apologizes for her hatred. She says there's good reason for it, but it's not going to help. This is going to destroy the new Europe if we, and I just want to apologize to all the Germans present that I had such hatred for them in my heart. And there's a young ex-Nazi in the audience who was going to get up and object to this resistance leader giving a political speech. And instead, he has the same kind of moment that Frank Bookman engendered in Irene Law when he said, how are you going to build a new Europe without the Germans? This young German suddenly just gets smitten by the fact that he hasn't done his own, what you might call, or what in 12-step would call, his own moral inventory. He hasn't thought about what he's done wrong.
Right.
And before long, he's getting up and apologizing for his side of the thing. Then Irene Law and this young man, who later goes on to become a member of parliament in Germany, they lead a party of 250 people from this conference center that goes all the way through Germany to every land parliament, every local provincial parliament, I think, except one, all kinds of venues. It includes Jewish people who've lost dozens of relatives in the Holocaust. It includes French, British, Americans, etc. They hold these kind of meetings about reconciliation. So at the same time that this was going on, there was some visionaries in the French government, particularly one man, who had dreamed of a federation of Europe. He thought that the thing that could happen, possibly, the way to start, was an agreement between France and Germany in particular, but smaller countries as well, to unify their war-making industries so the coal and steel industries could be unified and, in the end, by 1951, they created this extraordinary thing, which to my mind must be the most amazing peace initiative in history practically, whereas these two countries that had fought two world wars and the Franco-Prussian War before that, leading to tens of millions of people dying, actually unified their own war-making industries so that they could not go to war with each other again. That was called the European Coal and Steel Community. It included France and Germany and 4 other smaller countries. And gradually it grew and grew, and today it's called the European Community. That became the Federation of Europe, which nowadays is not understood in this way as the most extraordinary peace agreement in history. But Frank Buchmann was decorated by the German government and the French government for his contribution to that. A recent history of how all this happened says that there were 2 parallel paths that enabled this to happen. One was the strategic thinking and work of leading politicians, visionary politicians, and the other was the grassroots efforts at reconciliation. Other people were also working at grassroots reconciliation, but the largest by far was this initiative by Moral Rearmament. The reason that I wrote this memoir is really to honor my parents, because I think that their work and Frank Buchmann's work is one of the great unknown stories of the 20th century, not only because of the creation of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 Steps, which is huge in itself. I mean, I've heard that described as the greatest single American contribution to world spirituality and religion. It's an enormous thing, and millions, as you know better than I do, around the world have benefited from that. But what's much less known is the contribution of Moral Rearmament to the creation of the European Union, or at least the coal and steel community that became the European Union. And there's a book called Frank Buchmann's Secret, which is from within the movement. I mean, the movement, okay, so what went wrong with Buchmann? The Life of Frank Buchmann by Garth Lean, which you can buy and study, includes all these. Oh, there you are, On the Tail of a Comet.
On the Tail of a Comet. I'll put it in the show notes.
That's a fantastic book. But bear in mind, you had this lovely program, Bill, that I just really enjoyed listening to recently about the myths of early AA, in which Bill Wilson had his own way of talking about who was present at what event and so on. And he built this, he was a wonderful storyteller. What I enjoyed about your episode of your podcast was that you and this other guy who had written about this thoroughly committed to AA, and you love Bill Wilson, but at the same time, you were able to laugh about what a PR guy he was and how he changed the facts in order to get the true message across. Well, Buchmann was a master at this himself, and the whole of the Oxford Group and MRA were very adept at telling their stories.
Yes.
You read this book, On the Tail of a Comet. I don't know exactly how much truth there is in all these stories.
Well, I would say the same about the New Testament.
Well, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. That if you read it as history, you're going to miss the point.
Yes.
That people felt perfectly free to put words into Jesus' mouth.
No, absolute good point.
And so you're listening to the community. That doesn't make it unimportant, but you have to be a little bit educated, to avoid distorting who he was.
Yes. Yes. So after I've completed my doctorate, I thought it would be lovely if the minor academic industry arose where people actually researched these things like the creation of the European coal and steel community, to try and find out exactly what the role of these spiritual life changers was. What was their actual role? Would we have the European community now if there had not been Frank Buchmann and Philippe Martu and all these, and Irene Law, all these people? I don't know. And I haven't seen a good study of it. And I want to see people study this. But there was something about, okay, so what was Buchmann's downfall? One of my favorite quotes in my book. So I have this uncle, my Uncle Oliver, now long gone. Uncle Oliver was a really sort of odd maverick character, like all my mother's brothers. And he worked for Buchmann as his sort of valet and chauffeur, and I think sort of confessor. He really enjoyed getting close to important people. I think he was quite a snob, my Uncle Oliver. He liked to be with important people, but he what he offered them was a remarkable sort of truth-telling. So the quote in my book comes from some big Oxford group meeting in probably in the 1950s, where Bookman is railing at his followers, saying, you have to follow Jesus Christ and not me, because he knew that they treated the great leader with way too much kowtowing, if that's the right word.
Yeah.
They
We do
bent
the same.
down
We
for
do
the
the same with Bill Wilson.
And Bill Wilson hated it.
He hated it, and it was unhealthy for the people doing it.
Thank you. And that was partly why that's had a lot to do with why he developed the 12 traditions.
Which is his greatest gift.
He had a hell of a time getting it accepted.
Of course.
People didn't want the 12 traditions.
No.
My favorite quote from Bill Wilson, I remember this from long ago, maybe when I was doing my doctorate, I don't know. But the quote was, if people in AA treat me like the people in the Oxford group treat Bookman, it will drive me right back on the bottle.
Right.
In other words.
And it would have destroyed the movement, too.
It would. In a word, I think that is what destroyed.
Yeah.
More around.
And I think that's what's destroying the church today, too.
Well,
rather than following Jesus, we put him on the pedestal and we worship him. Hell of a lot easier to do that than to follow him. Back to that experiential, to experience what he experienced. And that's what he encouraged people to do.
So I think part of the issue with Bookman was his strategic thinking about how the world's problems could be solved, how France and Germany could reconcile with each other. These are huge thoughts. Who would think that their personal change modality could actually resolve, like Israel-Palestine right now, Ukraine and Russia right now? Who would have the ambition that they could move into that situation? I mean, actually, quite a lot of people are trying to do this sort of work in Israel-Palestine. I'm not entirely clear about Russia and Ukraine, although I know that the Rearmament has been very involved with them now for 50 years. But anyway, I think that Bookman thought that in order to have his vision become reality, he had to be in control. So one of the things that greatly annoyed A.J. Russell, the guy who wrote Facilas Only, was in the late 1930s, like Russell wanted to hold a group revival in some town, and the Oxford group people said to him, well, have you checked with Bookman? Russell said, I don't have to check with Bookman. It's like, why did you? In fact, Bookman was living in a hotel in central London called Brown's Hotel. And the actual phrase was, have you checked with Brown's Hotel? Meaning the commissariat, the people who are running this movement, they need to be in charge of every strategic decision. That was a killer on the movement.
In AA parlance, it's have you checked with the central office?
Right, but that's what was so brilliant about the 12 traditions.
Right.
As I understand it, was that he demoted the central office from having that kind of role.
Right. He tried to. But will we let it happen?
You know more about that than I do.
Yeah.
But I've heard AA described, or the 12 Steps described, as sort of the largest anarchistic organization in the world.
And Wilson wanted to keep it that way. His belief is if the spirit wasn't working in a group, it would self-destruct. And let that happen. But if you try to impose it from above, you're going to destroy it. So it's that tension, that creative tension that he brought, and again, he's not appreciated as much for the traditions as he is for the steps. And he didn't really invent the steps. I mean, they came from you guys, you know?
Yeah, no, that I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I don't think Bookman knew how to do what he wanted to do without retaining control of the movement. People way too much gave up their power to him and what I think of as groupthink. I mean, I think I'm sure there's tons of groupthink in the 12-step world as well.
Tons.
But groupthink became so dominant that when I was a young man and I was, trying to ask these questions that my journey to India had raised in me was, how do we apply life-changing to world poverty? I was asking all those questions and many other questions about, we can talk another time about guidance, what you call two-way prayer. But a bunch of that seemed phony to me. But I couldn't talk about it. I couldn't ask about it. There was an extreme Puritanism around sex. So as a teenager, I was not allowed to have even not only was I not allowed to date a young woman, I couldn't even talk with her. It's like the only young woman I ever talked with was my sister. We could go into that as well. But in other words, a kind of cultic groupthink orthodoxy and a huge us and them feeling. It was like we were changed. That was our word.
Right.
We didn't say converted. We were the changed, and God was directing us, and we were the hope of the world.
Yeah.
And all those people out there were unchanged. I mean, the amount of us and them that I experienced as a child was huge because we also felt persecuted by the outside world. It was, anyway, we could go into that.
We will.
That was the downfall of the movement I mean, it's still around, so I don't want to exaggerate its downfall. It survived, but not in the way that AA has survived.
No, it's become initiatives of change.
Right.
And the idea behind it is take Bookman's basic beliefs and you create something out there in the world that will affect this change where you live. And so they've got 50 or so different initiatives going on all around the world, run by the people who are there on the scene, taking these ideas and such, and trying to put them into practice.
The Oxford Group was a revival. It was like huge. It was the excitement, the energy. That energy has largely been missing.
Right.
From initiatives of change, but sometimes it crops up.
Yeah.
I don't know that much about it, and I don't want to run it down at all. But I do wish that people could know more about the Oxford Group and about MRA in what I think of its heyday in 1940s, 50s. So one thing I wanted to mention was that in 2011, Harper's Magazine, which is this, highbrow American magazine, did a cover issue going into, it was a big deal in 2011 to feature the recovery movement, which, a lot of people in sort of elite institutions had looked down their noses at the recovery movement, the me decade. People thought it was all about me and all that sort of thing. Anyway, they did this big cover article about AA. And in the very first paragraph, they described AA as coming out of, quote, a defunct 19-piece evangelical movement. Where had they got the idea that it was defunct? In many ways, its best days were to come in the 40s and 50s when they were so involved with this reconciliation work, which was huge. I think they got that from AA itself. But 5 minutes on the internet, which was perfectly in existence in 2011, would have told them otherwise. So that's a level of obscurity that moral rearmament fell into. When a friend of mine, around that time, 20 years ago, wanted to do her doctorate in sociology on moral rearmament, her professor in an American university said, no, that's not worth studying, because if it was, I would have heard of it. So this movement has gone into such total obscurity within academia and media. If you hear about it at all nowadays, it's probably when Glenn Close, the actress, talks about this awful cult that she was raised in. And I would love for Glenn to be able to read my book, because there's a beautiful book by Glenn Close and her sister, mainly by her sister, about her sister's recovery from addiction, which they thank AA and the 12-step world. And in many ways, they blame moral rearmament for the trauma that led to her addiction. But nowhere in the book do they mention the odd fact that Bookman is behind both of those things. Without Bookman, there would be no AA, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I agree.
Because growing up in moral rearmament, as Glenn and I are about the same age, she's a couple of years older. Growing up at that time, we did not talk about AA. We did not say, oh, AA grew out of our work. I didn't even know.
I was always amazed when I got a hold of On the Tail of a Comet. It gets maybe a page or two of reference in here. That's about it. It's, 400, 800 pages? I don't know.
Yes. Bill Wilson was told by the Oxford Group people, 1937, that he was not maximum, that was jargon of the day for you're not really doing this work properly.
His wife said we got thrown out.
Yes, his wife. Nice. Lois said they got thrown out because they were not maximum.
Yeah.
just tells you about us and them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Alka AA was part of them as far as we were concerned growing up. They were
The
people
Alcoholic
that hadn't-
Squad, it was called.
Yes, but they hadn't got the full message.
No, they weren't Maximal.
They weren't maximum.
Listen, hey, we could go on, and I think I want to save some of this for future
Sure.
episodes, but I think you guys can get a taste what lies underneath the 12 steps and the AA program, and we're going to go deeper into these in some of these next episodes. But I just wanted to lay the foundation of who was Bookman, what was he about, what was this group trying to do, and then we're going to look at the steps. How did we take these? Because there were no steps, right, Dave? There really were no.
I don't think Bookman liked the thing that Bill Wilson did with...
No, it becomes mechanical. It becomes mechanical instead of being transformational. So there's that delicate balance that one has to keep in approaching the steps, because they wind up getting worshipped today. That's what I see happening in 12-step. You worship the steps, and we worship Bill Wilson. That's much easier. And they're helpful. There's no,
No, they have an absolute genius of themselves. Yeah. This is part of the trouble with any genius person or methodology that actually saves your life.
Right.
You worship it, you focus on it. It's really hard to...
And you miss the message.
It's very hard to be a human being.
It's the toughest thing in the world. In the Jewish tradition, the angels were supposed to bow whenever a human being walked by.
Yes,
I love that.
Yes.
They have a much harder time of it than the guys with the wings, Well, listen, Dave, let's leave it. We'll leave it there. We got to close this somehow and sometime.
Okay.
We'll come back next week and we will dig in a little bit deeper in some of these other elements. So thank you so much for joining and for sharing your experience. And we're going to go deeper into your life and what that was like. And once again, the book is The World Remakers Child. It's in the show notes. Be sure to get a copy. I think you're going to really, really enjoy it. So thank you guys for listening. God bless, and keep coming back. If I could ask a favor now, please help us spread the word about two-way prayer. Your donations, whether large or small, really help keep the lights on here. And you can now find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Giving a thumbs up and subscribing help us reach more people, and sharing this content with friends might actually help make a real difference in their recovery. Finally, the description below links you to our two-way prayer website and to our new book, The Power of Two-Way Prayer. So once again, thank you for listening. God bless, and keep coming back.